My son-in-law called my retirement gift an old man's trinket and tossed it across the table at his own promotion dinner. Everyone laughed. My daughter laughed loudest. I picked it up, wiped it clean, and walked out without a word. The next morning, I drove to my accountant's office. When I told him what I wanted to do, he went quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Margaret, are you absolutely certain?" I told him I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. Before I go on, have you ever worked your whole life building something, only to have the people you built it for treat you like you were nothing? Leave a comment. I read every single one. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe. Some details here have been changed to protect privacy, but the lesson is completely real. Now let me tell you what happened next. The Crowne Plaza on King Street in downtown Toronto was decorated the way my son-in-law liked everything expensive-looking and cold. Crystal centerpieces, white orchids flown in from somewhere, a private dining room on the 14th floor reserved for 26 guests. My daughter had called it an intimate celebration. "Intimate," she said, while renting out a room that cost more per hour than I used to make in a day. My name is Margaret Calloway. I am 64 years old. I have worked as an electrician's apprentice, then a journeywoman, then a licensed master electrician for 38 years. I drove a work van. I wore steel-toed boots every single day. I came home smelling like copper wire and insulation foam, and I never once thought that was something to be ashamed of. My daughter Claire had married Daniel Mercer 3 years before that dinner. Daniel was 37, a VP of something at a commercial real estate development firm in Mississauga. He wore cufflinks to casual events. He had opinions about wine that he shared without being asked. He had never, in 3 years of knowing me, once asked what I actually did for a living. Not once. The dinner was for his promotion to senior vice president. Claire had organized everything. She'd sent printed invitations printed on cardstock with a gold foil border, and when I asked if I should bring anything, she said, "Just dress nicely, Mum. Please." I dressed nicely. Navy blazer? Good slacks. The pearl earrings I'd worn to Claire's university graduation. I drove myself downtown, parked in the hotel garage, and took the elevator to the 14th floor, carrying a small box wrapped in brown craft paper tied with a piece of twine. Inside the box was my grandfather's transit level, a surveying instrument from the 1940s, brass and cast iron, still perfectly calibrated. My grandfather had used it to help build 3 bridges in rural Nova Scotia. My father had kept it on his workbench his whole life. When he passed, he left it to me because I was the one who understood what it meant. I had carried it with me for 22 years. I wanted Daniel to have it. I thought I genuinely believed that a man who built buildings for a living might understand what it meant to hold something that had helped build something real. I was wrong. The dinner was already in full swing when I arrived. Champagne had been poured. Daniel was at the head of the table, tie loosened, laughing at something one of his colleagues had said. Claire was beside him in a dress I didn't recognize, her hair done up, looking every inch the wife of a senior VP. She saw me come in and her smile flickered just for a second before she rearranged it. "Mom, you made it." She kissed my cheek. "Come sit down." I found my seat near the end of the table, between Daniel's mother Patricia and a colleague of his whose name I didn't catch. Patricia Mercer was 70, retired from teaching, perfectly pleasant in the way of someone who has decided pleasantness is armor. She smiled at me. I smiled back. After the main course, Claire stood and gave a small speech about Daniel's dedication. People clinked their glasses. Daniel looked exactly like a man who expected this. Then Claire nodded at me. "My mum wanted to say a few words and give Daniel something," she said. I hadn't planned a speech. I stood up and said simply that I hoped Daniel would find meaning in what I was giving him, that it had meant a great deal to the men in my family, and that I hoped it would mean something to him too. I slid the box down the table toward him. He unwrapped it slowly, with the energy of someone who has already decided they won't like what's inside. When the craft paper fell away and the transit level sat there on the white tablecloth, brass gleaming under the chandelier light, Daniel stared at it for a moment. Then he picked it up with 2 fingers, like it was something he'd found in a parking lot. "What is this exactly?" He turned it over. "Is this some kind of old surveying thing?" "It's a transit level," I said. "It belonged to my grandfather." He used it to— "It's vintage," said Patricia, leaning over to look, and I heard genuine warmth in her voice. But Daniel had already set it down. He slid it to the side, away from his champagne glass, away from the orchid centerpiece. He glanced at his colleague, and something passed between them. "An old man's trinket," he said with a small laugh. "Margaret, that's very sweet." His colleague smiled. Someone else at the table chuckled. Claire looked down at her plate. I looked at my daughter. I waited for her to say something. To say anything. She reached for her wine glass. "Daniel collects modern art," she said quietly, to no one in particular. "He's not really a vintage tools kind of person." I heard the rest of the laughter from far away, the way you hear things when your ears have gone quiet with something that isn't quite grief and isn't quite anger. It's the specific feeling of understanding something you'd been refusing to understand for a long time. I reached down the table and picked up the transit level. I wrapped it back in the craft paper. I folded the twine. I put it in my bag. Then I said goodnight to Patricia Mercer, who looked at me with an expression I will not forget, and I walked out. In the elevator going down, I stood with my bag against my chest and thought about my grandfather, about my father, about 38 years of wiring buildings that men like Daniel Mercer would eventually put their names on. By the time I reached the parking garage, I had made a decision. That night, my condo was quiet. I lived in a 2-bedroom on the 16th floor in Scarborough, bought in 2009 for $310,000, worth considerably more now. I had bought it outright, no mortgage. I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of red rose tea and a manila folder I pulled from the filing cabinet in the second bedroom. The second bedroom was where I kept the paperwork. 38 years of licensed electrical work will make you a decent living if you're careful, and I had been very careful. I'd worked union for 20 years, then gone independent in 2005 when I realized I could make more running my own crew. Calloway Electrical had started as me and 2 apprentices working out of a second-hand van. By the time I sold the business in 2021, I had 22 licensed electricians on payroll, 2 company trucks, a commercial client list that included 12 active construction projects, and a reputation for showing up on time and doing it right the first time. I sold Calloway Electrical for $2.1 million. I had not told Claire. There were also the properties. I had started buying rental units in 2003, the year her father and I divorced, and I needed to find a way to make sure she would always have something. A duplex in Hamilton, a triplex in Oshawa, a 4-unit building in Barrie. Small properties, bought cheap, maintained well, rented to working families. The rent covered the mortgages, and then paid off the mortgages, and then started building something else. Current rental income, $14,200 per month. Current combined property value, $3.8 million. And then there was the account. The one I'd opened in 1993 when Claire was 7 years old, the year I got my master electrician certification, and the foreman at the union hall told me I should think about the future. I had set up an automatic transfer every paycheck, $100, then $200, then more as the business grew. I had never touched it, not once in 31 years. The current balance, with accumulated interest and reinvested dividends, was $1.4 million. I had planned to give it to Claire when the time was right. I drank my tea and looked at the numbers in the folder and thought about the sound of laughter in a 14th floor dining room. The time, I decided, was going to need to look a little different than I'd imagined. The next morning, I drove to the offices of Harwood & Associates on Bay Street. My accountant, Gary Harwood, had been managing my affairs for 19 years. He was 61, sharp, kept his office at precisely the right temperature, and had never once tried to tell me what to do with my own money. When I laid out what I was considering, he listened without interrupting. Then he took off his reading glasses. "Margaret," he said, "are you absolutely certain?" I told him I'd never been more certain of anything in my life. We spent 2 hours going through the structure. By the time I left, 4 things had been set in motion. I drove home, changed into my work clothes out of habit, and called a property manager I'd been in contact with for 6 months about a particular piece of land in Whitby. 4 days later, I was sitting in the back corner of a Tim Hortons on Lawrence Avenue when the man across from me opened a folder and slid a photograph across the table. His name was Robert Fenwick. He had spent 22 years with the OPP Financial Crimes Unit before going private. He was 64, wore a Tilly hat even indoors, and drank his coffee black. Helen Harwood, Gary's wife, who happened to sit on 2 corporate boards in the GTA, had given me his name. "Your son-in-law has been at Mercer Dalton Group for 9 years, Robert said, without preamble. He tapped the photograph. Officially, he makes $185,000 a year plus bonuses. That's his T4. And unofficially? Robert pulled out a second sheet. He's been living like he makes 3 times that. Leased a BMW 7 Series, $1,850 a month. Country club in Oakville, $12,000 annual fee. 2 international trips in the last 14 months. A renovation on the Mississauga house in 2023, kitchen and primary suite, roughly $140,000 cash. I looked at the numbers. Where is it coming from? That took me a bit longer to untangle. Robert folded his hands on the table. Mercer Dalton does commercial property development. Daniel manages investor accounts, pools capital from private clients, allocates it to projects, reports back on returns. He's been managing 4 accounts that have shown consistently below market returns. His clients think it's market conditions. He paused. It isn't market conditions, I said. No, he's been skimming management fees and reporting the excess as overhead, small amounts from each account, structured carefully. Total over 18 months, approximately $310,000. I let that number sit in the air between us. My daughter, I said. Her name doesn't appear anywhere in the financial records. Her personal accounts are separate. She has no access to the investor portfolios. As far as I can tell, she genuinely doesn't know. I looked out the window at Lawrence Avenue. A city bus was pulling away from the stop. A woman in scrubs was hurrying toward it, hand raised. What does she think the renovation money was? I asked. According to a joint tax filing I was able to access publicly, they declared a home equity line of credit drawdown, $120,000. The house had enough equity to support it, so she signed off on the HELOC. She would have signed the bank documents, yes. Whether she knew how it was being used, Robert shrugged carefully. That I can't tell you. I thought about that for a long time on the drive home. My daughter had signed papers. She might have known. She might have simply trusted her husband. Those were 2 very different things, and I needed to know which one was true before I did anything else. I didn't call Claire. I sat with what I knew for 5 days. I went to work. I still consulted part-time for a commercial contractor in Pickering, mostly because I liked having somewhere to be, and I came home and I made my dinners, and I thought about what it meant to build something for 38 years, and what it meant to have it dismissed in 8 words over champagne. An old man's trinket. On the 6th day, I called Robert Fenwick and asked him to keep watching. Then I called Gary. Then I called the Ontario Securities Commission's whistleblower tip line. I spent 45 minutes on that call. I had documentation. I had account numbers. I had the names of the 4 investor clients whose portfolios had been affected. I had transaction records Robert had compiled. I answered every question the intake officer asked, clearly and without embellishment, and at the end of it, they gave me a reference number and told me the matter would be reviewed. I wrote the number on a piece of paper and put it in the drawer where I keep important things. 3 days after that, Claire called. I was at the Pickering job site when my phone buzzed. I stepped away from the crew and answered. Mom. Her voice was wrong. Tight in a way I recognized from when she was 16 and had done something she was afraid to tell me. Can we get together? Daniel's been strange lately. I don't know what's going on. He won't talk to me, and he keeps taking calls in the garage. I thought it might help to talk. I said, I'm glad you called. She was quiet for a moment. Are you still angry about the dinner? I'm not angry, I said, and I meant it. Anger had lasted about as far as the hotel parking garage. What had replaced it was something quieter and much more purposeful. Claire, I want you to do something for me. Come to the house on Saturday. Bring any financial documents you have access to, the HELOC paperwork, anything from Daniel's firm, the investment account statements if you have them. Can you do that? Why? Because I think there are some things you need to understand, and I'd rather tell you in person. She came on Saturday morning. She sat at my kitchen table in the same chair she'd sat in as a teenager doing homework, and I told her carefully, without dramatics, what Robert Fenwick had found. I watched her face. I had been afraid, for those 3 days, that I would see calculation in her expression, that she would look like someone who had known. Instead, what I saw was the particular unraveling of a person who has been told that the floor of their life is made of something much less solid than they'd believed. She cried. Not performatively quietly, with her hands flat on the table, tears dropping onto the placemat. "The renovation," she finally said. "I know. He told me it was the HELOC. He showed me the documents. I know. That part's true. He drew down the HELOC. But the clients," her voice broke. "He stole from his clients. That's what the evidence indicates." "Mum," she looked up at me. "Did you report this?" "Yes." She made a sound I can't quite describe. Not protest, not relief, something raw in between. "You should get your own lawyer," I said. "Before anything else happens. Today if you can. I have a name." She nodded. She was already reaching for her phone. She didn't ask me about the dinner. Not that day. I think she understood, somewhere underneath everything else, that we would get to that when she was ready. I gave her the name of a family and estates lawyer I trusted, a woman named Patricia Duong, who worked out of a firm in North York. Then I drove to Whitby to look at the land I had been thinking about for 6 months. It was February, the ground was frozen and the site was rough. 4.8 acres on the north edge of town, formerly commercial, rezoned residential the previous year. I had put down a conditional offer in November. The condition had been met. The land was mine. I stood at the edge of the site in my Carhartt jacket and steel-toed boots and looked at the bare trees at the property line, and I thought about what a master electrician from Scarborough, with 38 years of union calluses and a very quiet investment portfolio, could build on 4.8 acres. 62 units. Affordable rental housing, designed for the people who wire the buildings and drive the buses and change the bed sheets in hotels where other people celebrate. I had spoken to an architect. I had spoken to a development consultant in Whitby who had 15 years of experience with affordable housing projects in Durham region. I had spoken to a not-for-profit housing organization in Oshawa who wanted to be involved in operations. Gary had gone over the numbers 4 times. The project was feasible, not profitable, not in the traditional sense, but sustainable. The properties I already owned would generate enough income to service the construction financing. The sale of Calloway Electrical had provided the equity. The account, the 31-year account, would cover the remaining gap. I wasn't spending Claire's inheritance on this. I was deciding that this was what I wanted to build next. I drove back to Scarborough with the smell of cold earth still on my jacket and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday morning in March, Daniel Mercer was contacted by investigators from the Ontario Securities Commission. His firm received a formal notice of investigation the same day. Robert Fenwick called me that evening to let me know the process had formally begun. These investigations moved carefully and took time, months at minimum, possibly longer. But they had started. Claire had already moved out of the Mississauga house. She was staying with a friend in Leslieville. She had retained Patricia Duong. She had also spoken to Daniel's firm directly, through her lawyer, and provided a written statement confirming that she had not been aware of the financial irregularities and had not benefited from them beyond the HELOC drawdown, which had been presented to her as a legitimate home financing tool. Patricia Duong told me that Claire's position was well documented and that she was unlikely to face any personal liability. Daniel had hired a criminal defense lawyer. I had not spoken to Daniel. I had nothing to say to him. Claire called me every few days. Our conversations were careful at first, the way conversations are between people who have things to say that neither of them quite knows how to start. Then, one evening in late March, she said, "Mom, the dinner." Yes. I didn't say anything. No. When he said that about the transit level, I should have said something. I didn't respond right away. Outside my kitchen window, the parking lot lights were coming on one by one in the blue dusk. "You want to know why I didn't tell you," I said. "About the business. About the properties. I want to understand. Because I wanted to know who you'd become," I said. "Without the money being part of the equation." I wanted to know if you chose your husband because you loved him or because of what he looked like on paper. And I wanted to know, when things got difficult, who you would be." She was quiet for a long time. "I laughed," she said. When they laughed, I didn't say anything, and I reached for my wine. "I was embarrassed. Of me. Of myself," she said, and her voice was very small. "I think I'd been embarrassed of myself for a long time, and I didn't know how to. I just kept making it worse." That was the most honest thing my daughter had said to me in years. I let it land the way it needed to. "Come to Whitby with me on Saturday," I said. "I want to show you something." The site in Whitby on a March Saturday looked like the beginning of something, which is exactly what it was. The snow had pulled back enough to show the outline of the excavation that had begun the week before. There was a temporary construction fence around the perimeter and a project sign that read, "Calloway Place Affordable Housing Community, 62 Homes." Claire stood beside me in her winter coat, hands in her pockets, looking at the sign. "You named it after yourself," she said. "After the family," I said. She looked at the excavation, the scale of it. "How long have you been planning this?" 6 months, actively. 38 years, in a way. She turned to look at me. She had her father's eyes dark brown, direct in my jaw, the stubborn set of it that I had always privately been pleased to see in her. "Who's it for?" she asked. "Electricians," I said. "Plumbers. Early childhood educators, personal support workers. People who do the work that makes everything else possible and can't afford to live in the city they work in." Claire was quiet. I watched something moving in her face. "I used to tell Daniel that you were just an electrician," she said, like it was a small thing. "I know. It wasn't small." "No," I agreed. "It wasn't." We stood in the cold for a while, looking at the 4.8 acres that would become 62 homes. A crow landed on the construction fence and regarded us for a moment before flying off. "Can I help?" Claire asked. I looked at her. "Patricia Duong does family and estates law," I said. "But she told me once she's been looking for pro bono work in the housing sector. I imagine a development project like this will need a lot of legal documentation." Claire looked at me steadily. "I have a marketing background." "I know. I could help with tenant outreach, community communications, getting the word out to the people it's actually for." "That would be useful," I said, "if you're serious about it." "I'm serious." I nodded. I didn't hug her. We weren't quite there yet, but I turned and started walking toward the site office, a small trailer near the entrance, and she fell into step beside me, and that was something. She called 17 times in the first month she was working on the project. Not out of crisis this time, but out of questions, about tenants, about eligibility criteria, about how the subsidy model worked, about whether we could partner with a local elementary school for a community garden. I answered every call. Not because she needed rescuing, but because she was learning, and that was worth every minute. The OSC investigation into Daniel's conduct proceeded over the following months. I won't speak to the details of what happened because that story belongs to the people whose savings he had manipulated, not to me. What I can say is that by October, a settlement agreement had been reached that included full restitution to the affected investor clients, a significant financial penalty, and a permanent ban from the securities industry in Canada. Criminal charges were referred to the Crown. Claire's divorce was finalized in September. She moved into a small apartment in Whitby, partly because it was close to the project site, partly, I think, because she needed to start over somewhere that didn't carry so much weight. I still live in my condo in Scarborough. I still consult part-time on commercial electrical projects in Pickering and Markham. I still get my coffee from the Tim Hortons on Lawrence Avenue 3 mornings a week. The transit level from my grandfather sits on the shelf above my kitchen table. I took it out of the craft paper the week after the dinner at the Crowne Plaza, and I have not wrapped it up again. The first tenants moved into Calloway Place on the second Saturday of November. It was cold, proper November cold, the kind that has intention to it, and there was a small opening event in the courtyard between the buildings. I had not planned speeches. But a woman named Susan Chen, who was a personal support worker at a long-term care facility in Whitby and who had been on a waiting list for affordable housing for 3 years, found me standing near the courtyard entrance and put her hand on my arm. "I wanted to say thank you," she said. "My daughter has her own room for the first time." I shook her hand. I said she had worked for this, and the best thanks I could ask for was that she know her work had dignity and worth, regardless of what anyone else decided it meant. She smiled at me in the way of someone who has heard that truth said out loud for perhaps the first time. Claire was on the other side of the courtyard with a clipboard, helping a family navigate the elevator with a large piece of furniture. She was wearing steel-toed boots. I had not asked her to. She had gone out and bought them herself. That evening, after the tenants had settled in and the last of the volunteers had gone home, I drove back to Scarborough. I unlocked the condo, put the kettle on, and sat at my kitchen table with my tea and looked at my grandfather's transit level on the shelf. In 38 years, I had wired hospitals and schools and office towers and community centers. I had trained 46 apprentices. I had built a business from nothing and sold it and built something else with the proceeds, something that 62 families would sleep inside tonight for the first time. An old man's trinket. Those words had unlocked something. Not because they were right, because they reminded me that I had been building something my whole life that was never about impressing anyone. It was about doing the work, doing it right, leaving something behind that mattered after the praise had faded and the champagne glasses had been cleared away. My phone lit up on the table. A text from Claire. First snow of the year. Site looks beautiful. Thought you'd want to know. I looked at it for a long moment. Then I typed back, I'll come by Tuesday. We should talk about the Phase 2 land. A pause. Then, there's a Phase 2? There will be, I wrote. Get some rest. We have work to do. I set the phone down and looked at my grandfather's transit level in the lamplight, that instrument built to find the true horizontal, to tell you when something is level with the ground, when something is honest and plumb and real. I had never needed it to build anything. I had carried it all these years to remind myself what kind of work was worth doing. My daughter was learning. Slowly, the way all real learning happens. Through effort and repetition and small daily choices to show up and be honest. I would not rush it. I would not offer it as a transaction. You do this, I forgive you. Forgiveness was not a ledger. It was a direction. I was already facing it. And to anyone listening to this story, your work is not the measure of your worth, but it is the measure of your character. Every job done with honesty and care, whether you're running wire in a wall cavity at 2 a.m, or mopping a floor, or driving a route nobody notices, is a foundation. You are building something whether you can see it or not. The question is whether the people around you are worth building it for. If they aren't, you can still build. You just build for someone else. There are always families who need a home. There is always a foundation waiting to be poured. And if someone calls your gift a trinket, well, let them. Just make sure you take it back before you leave the room.